I attend a college that is located in one of the poorest cities in Northern California. The campus is relatively safe since the school employs its own Department of Public Safety, but after the sun sets, it's usually a good call to remain indoors because that's when the townies come out and they tend to wander on the campus. About 2 years ago, I was living in an apartment complex on the main part of campus, and I still didn't have a car yet. It was the end of the fall semester, and I was the last person in my apartment of 3 girls to finish taking finals, so I was home alone since my roommates had already gone home for winter break. I got back from taking my last exam and followed my usual routine of collapsing into bed to cry and sleep off the effects of pulling an all-nighter. When I finally woke up, it was already past 10 p.m. and I was starving. Unfortunately, the student grocery store and cafeteria were closed for the day, and I had nothing in the apartment to eat and no car to get food elsewhere. I was woefully poking around the fridge in hopes that I would find something substantial to tide me over until morning when I noticed a Domino's coupon that someone had stuck to the freezer. My stomach's pathetic cries for sustenance had been answered. I quickly decided that there was no shame in ordering a whole pizza, plus cinnamon sticks, for myself because 1. I was ravenous, and 2. The completion of finals demanded some sort of celebration, and 3. If anyone happened to ask, I was going to lie and say I was sharing with a friend or something. Anyway, I eagerly order up my feast for 1 and provide the cashier with my address, apartment, and cell number. I typically never give out my number to anyone, but I had ordered delivery from Domino's in the past, and I knew that they needed my number to call me once they were outside, because the drivers always got lost navigating through campus. About 20 minutes later, I got the call. My food was here. For reference, it was now close to midnight, and the campus was pretty much dead, since most students had gone home. The driver told me he was parked in front of a dorm building that was right across the street from my apartment. I hustled out and was going down the stairs when I spotted the delivery guy waiting outside of his car with my pizza. At this point, my sense of caution kicked in and I slowed my pace as my brain took in the fact that there were no other students out. The lighting was bad, and I was essentially walking up to a stranger in his car that still had its engine running. As I neared the bottom of the steps, I silently hoped that he would cross the street and approach me so that I wouldn't have to get near the car. Of course, that didn't happen. I made my way across the street and was finally able to get a good look at him. He was a relatively short, Hispanic guy, maybe 5'7" to 5'9", in his early 20s, and my nerves were getting bombarded by the creeper vibes he was giving off. I can only compare it to the vibe that you get when you're out clubbing and suddenly spot the guy lurking in the crowd, sporting the slick back ponytail, sunglasses, oversized shirt, and sagged pants combo, who just so happens to be headed in your direction. I did my best to appear calm and keep the mood light and friendly. He made some comments about how it was late and no one else was around, but I just signed a receipt as quickly as possible, gave him my thanks and an awkward smile, and hightailed it out of there as soon as he handed me my food. I could feel him watching me as I climbed the stairs back to my place. Once I got back into my apartment, I locked and chained up the door and sat down on the living room couch to calm myself. After a few moments, I shrugged off the situation and reasoned that it was just my paranoia and overactive imagination acting up again. I had just turned on the TV and was about to take my first bite of pizza when I got a text from an unknown number. It read, "You're hella sexy." I connected the dots and matched the text number to the call that I had received earlier from the pizza delivery guy. My initial reaction, of course, was shock, since nothing like this has ever happened to me before. But that eventually melted away into laughter and disbelief when I considered my appearance at the time. Like I had mentioned earlier, I had just woken up from my nap after taking the last of my finals. I was wearing a pair of raggedy sweatpants and a loose sweatshirt, and my hair was nappy and tied up in a messy ponytail. My face was probably greasier than the pizza I was eating, and to top it off, I had my glasses on. Definitely not a pretty picture, much less anything that could come close to resembling hella sexy. The next morning, I got a call from my boyfriend John, and I casually told him about the events that had transpired the previous evening. After sheepishly trying to defend my actions on the basis of poor judgment, caused by extreme hunger, and promising never to do that type of thing again, John convinced me that I should report it to the campus police as a precautionary measure. I gave them a call, and an officer stopped by my apartment a few hours later. I relayed my story. He took some pictures of the text message, and he wrote down the phone number. The officer then told me that he could contact the Domino's if I wanted him to, but that it would most likely result in the driver's termination. I was still relatively unfazed by the whole situation, and I told the officer that I just wanted to make sure that this creep never did this to any other girls on campus, but at the same time I didn't want him to lose his job. The officer then started asking me questions about how I felt after my encounter. Questions along the lines of, do you feel threatened? Do you feel safe in your apartment with the knowledge that he has both your phone number and your exact address? If I wasn't scared before, I definitely was now. And during the course of my questioning, I had broken out in a cold sweat. And my traitorous imagination began conjuring up all sorts of dastardly situations that ended in my untimely demise. Obviously, I ended up giving the officer the go-ahead to pursue my case and contact Domino's. About a month later, while I was at home celebrating the holidays, I got a call from my boyfriend. I had left him the keys to my apartment so that he could store his bike there and crash in my room while I was away. He told me that he had stopped by my place, but that he couldn't get in because the keys weren't working. He also said that it looked like someone had broken in because there was some glass on the floor and a wooden board across my living room window. I was pretty upset because this was my first time hearing about it, so I called the school the next day to figure out what the hell had happened. Housing transferred my call to the public safety department, and the officer I spoke with was only able to tell me that, according to their records, a maintenance worker had called them 2 days after I'd headed home to report my broken window. Public safety had responded by boarding up the window and changing the lock when they noticed it had been tampered with. I convinced the officer to let my boyfriend into my apartment so he could check if anything was stolen, and thankfully, nothing was. My gut tells me that it was the Domino's driver who did it. It was him who tried to pick my lock and then broke my window. It scares me even more now when I consider the fact that nothing had been stolen. My flat screen TV was right by the window that was broken, and my boyfriend's fancy road bike was sitting right there in the living room. Why didn't they steal anything? Does that mean his intentions were to break in and get his revenge on me, the girl that had cost him his job? Would this still have happened if I hadn't given the officer permission to pursue the case? I try not to spend too much time speculating about what the intentions were, but when I do, it still makes my heart race when I think about what could have happened if I had still been in my apartment at the time. So I work at a pizza place, usually inside, as my insurance doesn't cover claims when driving for business. But occasionally, I will cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is pretty good. Our delivery area includes a few new development, upper middle class, cookie cutter neighborhoods, an older 1940s era village, 2 apartment complexes, some trailer parks, and a bunch of rural areas. Not rural to the point seeing hundreds of stars at night, but enough that you probably couldn't hear your neighbors yell. So, about a week ago, I was covering a delivery shift. I come back to the shop feeling pretty good. I'm averaging $5 a delivery, and they have all been pretty close, and check to see if I have any more. I have one to an address I've never seen before. We have mostly semi-regular deliveries, so an address that doesn't seem the least bit familiar is odd. It's out on one of the more rural roads. I asked the kid who took the order what was up, because there were special instructions on the ticket. He says, they said go around back because the front door isn't operational. I'm like, okay, that's not that uncommon. People often want you to go around back. Either they painted the door, the house shifted and it's a bitch to open, or they're just hanging out back. So, as I'm driving out to the house, I get this odd feeling. I don't really like the idea of going to the back of some house out in the sticks. It would all be too easy for some thugs to order a pizza to an abandoned house, There are quite a few in the more rural areas, and then jump the delivery guy. I figure I'll scope the place out when I get there, and if it seems sketchy, I'll just call them and make up some bull about how it's against company policy to go around the back of houses to prevent robberies. As I'm driving to the house, I realize it's towards the end of this road that gets less populated the further down you go. Great. I'm pretty close to the address and driving slow. I see this abandoned looking house set back from the road with no address and surrounded by a bunch of trees. I think, that house better not be it. So I drive past and check the next house's address, and lo and behold, that abandoned looking one was the right house. Shit. At this point, I'm not super worried though, because out in the boonies, the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low. So a house in disrepair isn't unusual. So I double back to this house and pull into the driveway. At this point, I'm getting bad vibes. It just doesn't seem right. So I park my car at the very end of the driveway with the rear of the car on the shoulder so anyone passing by can clearly see it. I call back to the shop and tell them I'm at this sketchy house, and if I don't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I don't answer, call the cops. While I'm on the phone, I take a chance to get a good look at the house. It looks extremely abandoned, and not just in disrepair. The driveway is crumbling, bits of gravel, and there are weeds growing out of it. There's no mailbox, no trash cans, no car, no lawnmowers, no landscaping, kids' toys, absolutely nothing in the yard. The yard hasn't been mowed in what looks like years. The house is total crap. The roof is all but falling apart. The siding is falling apart. The back deck, which comes around the side, is falling apart. The only part of the house that looks even a little bit decent is the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows are all shut. It's 95 degrees and humid, and this place doesn't have an AC. They all have the blinds or curtains shut. The few that aren't are actually boarded up. I don't even see any wires running to this house. It's not dark, but it's dusk, and there isn't a sign of any lights on. At this point, I'm starting to get pretty nervous. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds, not in any great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years, so I'm not helpless. But I do try to avoid any sort of confrontation I can, as I am mostly a pacifist. I'm not too concerned about getting robbed. No skin off my teeth, it's not my money. I mean, I would rather not get robbed, but I'm mostly worried about getting jumped or killed. It's a fairly safe area, but recently, there have been some rather unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies, but more worrying, a few stabbings and assaults. So, it's time to either nut up or shut up. I'm not just going to go charging in there like a fool, so I get out my phone and call the number they gave me when ordering. While I'm doing that, I'm also getting the pizza out and making sure to leave my door open. A running car, half in the road in an abandoned house with the door open looks suspicious, right? I figure if shit goes down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there is really any traffic this far down the road though. I'm starting to walk up to the house while the phone's ringing. It rings twice, and then an automated message comes on. It says something along the lines of, "This phone is associated with the internet texting app, one of the free ones you download, that lets you send free text from a different phone number over a data connection. I think it was haywire. We've had some issues with people using numbers from those services for pranks in the past. This is a huge red flag. My heart is now pounding in my throat, and my whole body is telling me to bail. I don't want to get a reputation for being a flaky bitch as a driver and lose any future delivery shifts, and that is why I hadn't bailed yet. So, I'm just standing there holding a pizza, looking at this house, but not wanting to venture around to the back of it. I'm hoping that the resident will look out the window and come out by the road to get their food. So I'm looking at the front windows checking for any signs of life. I see a blind go up on the one window next to the front door, and a really creepy looking guy with a hat pulled low and big sunglasses is looking out. Remember, he is in a completely dark house surrounded by trees at dusk. There is no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses. I also see what appears to be a big guy standing behind him in the room. This could have been anything though. When he sees me looking, he mouths something and darts away, presumably toward the allegedly broken front door. At this point, I nope the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to my car, so it was only a few steps away, and I jumped into the driver's seat and threw the pizza into my passenger seat, something I would never usually do, since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean. I slam it into reverse before I get the clutch all the way in, so I grind my gears a little, again, something I never do. Without looking, I simultaneously slam and lock my door, and floor it backwards onto the main road, slipping my clutch horribly, but at this point I don't care. I don't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I didn't even check for cross traffic, really stupid on my part. I start to drive away and look back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door is now open, but the front door is still shut. The guy isn't out in the front yard yelling, "Wait, come back," or anything. He's just gone. So I pull over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them that I'm all good, and I'll elaborate when I get back. The people never call back to inquire about their food. People usually call if their pizza is 15 minutes late, and these people never got it, so it's really strange they didn't call, pretty much confirming they were up to no good. After telling my coworkers about it, we concluded it was definitely a robbery at the very least. So we put the address and phone number on our no deliveries list and ate their pizza. I doubt I would have actually gotten murdered or anything. Robbed, with maybe a gun pulled, or a little roughing up, yes, but it was still very unnerving. That I easily could have gotten into some serious trouble by just doing my job. Especially if the idiots picked a slightly less abandoned house to set up at. Anyone who delivers pizza should be wary of situations like this. I looked into it, and apparently, it's a pretty common way to rob pizza guys. I'm pretty glad that we did not end up meeting.
When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired for losing his license, I was placed on the night shift. I really didn't want that shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an arsehole, and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to take the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues. That is, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it into our GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 PM. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. The house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait about another 30 seconds. Still, no answer. I'm standing there, getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But, thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there, staring at me. I ask him if he's okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza. And as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time, and again ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and that I couldn't wait to go home, which he chuckled at. "I know that feeling pretty well," he said as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking too straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number, as he'd, quote-unquote, love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked about 15, and I was hoping that he thought differently, and wasn't hitting on me because he thought I was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds, before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up with my co-workers. They agreed it was pretty creepy. They all agreed, that is, except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed that I was just making up stories for sympathy. Fucking arsehole. A week later, I'm working the night shift, and we get an order from that same guy again. This is when shit really hits the fan. I arrive at the house around 10:30 p.m. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and I walk up to the front door with the pizza box. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man. Except this time, he was wearing a suit. I jumped back. He laughs and says, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out of the window and figured I'd just open the door now so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in his house whatsoever. He was just sitting in the dark this whole time? If so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? I once again tell him that I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side. He then grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point, and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him. "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I have ever seen on someone's face, and says, "I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into his house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that, to this day, I am thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosens his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and starts trying to pull me out, holding the knife in the other hand. "Why are you making this so fucking difficult?" I grab a half-empty bottle of soda I had in the cup holder and throw it. Luckily, it hits him in the head, and he lets go. I slam the door, and then, all of a sudden, he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with the knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot, reversing down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as possible. In my panicked state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared he was following me. Eventually, I reached a red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat there at the intersection, frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I had just come close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel that I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there, crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew that something was wrong with me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front, wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had just happened and for putting me on the night shift. He takes me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself and any scratches on my car. My coworker followed me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily, a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later, I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife. The psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail for about 5 months before this encounter. When the cops arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he had run off to. The police insisted that they would find him. Indeed, they did. Only not alive. Apparently, the guy had fled to a nearby city and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out their window at the right time. They called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of the car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries. The psycho, on the other hand, succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they had done and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and light up a cigarette, taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what had happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with a psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me inside that house.